Managing data in SQL database managed by Azure. See, it is very important and well known fact that almost every application is going to have a database requirement. And traditionally, we have been using on-premise SQL Server or maybe something like Oracle or MySQL and so many other database options for performing all our CRUD operations: create, retrieve, update, and delete. So in this particular chapter, I'm going to demonstrate how we can make use of the Azure platform for storing and retrieving database with the help of SQL Database Service. So what we have on-premise SQL Server, we are going to replace that with SQL Database Service in Azure, and this particular chapter is going to split into two parts. In one part, the developer has to take care of all the things like connection string, creating database, and migrating database. Very importantly, using code first entity framework approach for using the SQL database. The second part is going to deal with all administration features like planning the deployment, using the features like elastic storage, what is to be done for monitoring the database, auditing the database, and what all things have to be taken care of for business continuity. And finally, we are going to have a substitute of SQL database in Azure, that is SQL Server, what we generally have in on-premise, same SQL Server in a virtual machine. We want to simply use Azure as a infrastructure having a virtual machine hosting SQL database, SQL Server database. So what all has to be done there? So net to net, in this particular chapter, we are going to have, by the end of this chapter, a complete application using all the services we have learned so far, the application services, using web app, and how our database can get stored in the SQL Server for persistency. So what is SQL database? Now, SQL database is a cloud-based relational database service. Very important, it's a service that is built on SQL Server technology. It supports almost all the features what we have in SQL Server, like PSQL commands. We can have tables, views, stored procedures, triggers. We can have indexes, constraints, all those things which we generally have in a SQL Server on premise. We are also going to have these facilities in SQL database. Of course, the internal architecture would be different from that of on-premise SQL Server. All that has to be taken care by Azure, and we are not supposed to be worried about it. SQL database delivers predictable performance, scalability with no downtime. That is the most important thing. Scalability with no downtime, business continuity, and data protection with near zero administration. See, one of the biggest problem with having our own local database is on-premise database is we always need to have a proper administrator for managing it, who would be responsible for ensuring the business continuity. That means has to take up regular backup, and in case of disaster has to properly restore the database. We need proper maintenance so that performance is supposed to be taken care of. We need to have ensure that proper hardware is taken care of. So these things we do not absolutely need when we are using SQL database, because all these things will be taken care by the Azure platform for us. And we as a developer would concentrate more on accelerating application development. Maybe changing the database also is all going to be very easy over here. And because it is based on SQL Server engine, all the existing tools what we use for SQL Server, all the libraries and APIs. For example, if you are using SQL Server on premise, you might be using in a .NET application ADO.NET libraries. Likewise, in Java, you might be using JDBC, or in general, let us say ODBC. So all these libraries and API support are as it is provided even for SQL database. That means we do not have a new learning curve. So whatever we have done or we have been doing it with our on-premise database for consuming and performing CRUD operations, same kind of coding we will have to continue even in SQL database. Yes, .NET developers can happily use entity framework for communicating with them. SQL database is available in basic, standard and premium service tiers, three basic service tiers. Each service tier offers different levels of performance and capability to support lightweight to heavyweight database workloads. See, not necessary that only if you have heavy database workload, lot of operations you have to move to SQL database. No, you can make use of the SQL database service feature of Azure even if you have a very basic requirement of storage in your application. Maybe initially you'll have a small database requirement where you want to invest little amount, and over a period of time as your application is growing or your clientele is growing, you may probably want to expand your size of the database, and at the same time you want to improve the performance of the database, and thus you would gradually migrate from basics to standard and from standard to premium. And of course your application would then be accessible throughout the world because Azure database is accessible all over the world. What are the benefits of having SQL database? High availability. There are three replicas created for every SQL database. Of course, based on the model, they are either in the same zone or in different zones. We are going to discuss that later. On demand. To have an SQL database provision, it hardly takes few minutes, not few hours. I'm saying few minutes. Within few minutes, we can have our SQL server and a database in that SQL server created, and we can start working with it in our application. So it is on demand provisioned whenever needed, and that too with few mouse clicks. And obviously, most important of all, reduced management overhead. As I said earlier, zero administration. Most of the things are taken care by the Azure platform, Azure support staff. We have to only make use of the database and configure as per the requirement. What are the top features? Azure top features. Yes, most of these features, if you see, are already there in SQL database. I mean SQL server. We have tables, views, indexes, roles, stored procedures, triggers, user-defined functions, constraints, transactions. Table also is there. Basic functions, mathematical functions, aggregate functions, which are generally used in TSQL, constants, cursors, index management, index rebuilding, local temporary tables, reserved keywords, statistics management, table variables are there, and of course, very important, TSQL support for writing stored procedures and triggers. Now, in short, most of the operations I would want to perform on my on-premise SQL server in routine application development, they're all available in SQL database. Now, this is important list. The following features of SQL Server on-premise are not supported in SQL database of Azure. It does not support Windows authentication. On-premise, we have got SQL authentication and Windows authentication. In SQL Azure database, we have to only make use of SQL authentication. Windows authentication is not there. There are very few SQL commands which are not supported in SQL database. User-defined data types are not there. User-defined functions are there, but user-defined types we cannot have. UDTs we call it. We do not have access to the system table here. We should not write any query which can perform operations on the SQL Server system tables. Not at all recommended. We do not have CLR support. That means we cannot write stored procedures and triggers in C Sharp using ADO.NET. We can do that actually in SQL Server, but here we do not have that facility. Database file placement, we do not have the choice of deciding where do we put the MDF and LDF files. We don't have the option for database mirroring because it is internally taken care of. Distributed queries, yes, we do not have the support. Distributed transaction, that is DTC. When we have multiple databases in different location, we want to have a transaction distributed over multiple databases. That support is not there. File groups management, full text search, global temp tables, they're always specific to a particular database here. We do not have direct support for backup and restore. We have to do it through portal or through PowerShell commands. Support for analysis service, SSRS, broker service, all these are not there in SQL database. Net to net, all those features which are either not required in basic application development or in Azure through a portal they have provided alternatives for most of those things, and that is the reason these features are not there in SQL database. So if you want to build an application which is going to make use of, let us say, SSRS, reporting service, analysis service, what to do? Yes, in those kind of cases, we have the alternative choice, that is, we create a virtual machine using SQL Server. That means we are making use of IaaS feature of Azure, infrastructure as a service. So we'll have a virtual machine with SQL Server setup, and that we can make use of in our application. And mind you, creating a virtual machine with SQL Server setup is going to hardly take few minutes, unlike having a on-premise SQL Server installation which might probably take few or couple of hours. So what is important? We are set to now go and create a SQL database and start using that in our application. But it is highly recommended that .NET applications which we are going to deploy in Azure, as a preferred option, we use SQL database of Azure rather than using infrastructure as a service VM for SQL Server or on-premise SQL Server. That's all in this. Thank you.